So kia ora, we're here this afternoon with Barbara Brookes. Thanks for speaking with us, Barbara. Before we begin, I just need to get a verbal confirmation from you, or verbal yes, that you are okay with being recorded today and interviewed today.
Yes, I'm happy to be interviewed and recorded today.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I've walked you through the topics that we'll cover, and the first topic is background about your life. So, as you think about where you are today, how would you depict the journey that brought you to this point? And you can consider your central commitments, what your career looked like, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in a pretty much non-academic household. My father had left school at 12, my mother at 16, and they were Irish immigrants to New Zealand. They came here in 1951. I was actually born here in 1955, but 3 of my siblings were born in Ireland, 3 of the 5 of us. But they were very keen that we all got an education, and I did well at school, and I loved English and I loved history, and my teachers were very encouraging that I should go on, and a number of them actually, I went to school in large co-ed secondary school in Christchurch, and they encouraged me to go to Otago because they had been to Otago. So I went to Otago thinking I was going to do English, but I fell in love with history. I found it, in a way, you could be more creative with history than you could with English at the way it was taught then, because there was kind of a canon you had to go through, and so many people had written so much about it. Really, so I did honours in history, and for my 4th year, I did a research project on abortion in New Zealand in the 1930s, supervised by Eric Olson. And I just loved it. And I was able to talk to some of the women who founded what was called the Sex Hygiene and Birth Regulation Society in 1936, which was the forerunner of family planning in New Zealand. And, you know, it just seemed like a hidden history. Nobody really had written about women's fears of being continually pregnant and what that meant, and their attempts at backstreet abortion. So it was really the archives that helped, I guess, sent me on my journey in a way, because then I became determined to do women's history. I became an activist in some of the abortion campaigns that were going on because of that history. And then I was encouraged to apply for international scholarships, and I got a scholarship to Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia, and I went there and I studied history both there. I did history of science at Bryn Mawr, and I did history of medicine with Charles Rosenberg at the University of Pennsylvania, and women's history with Carol Smith Rosenberg. So these were tremendously formative experiences for me. And I did my PhD on abortion in England in the interwar period. And I actually went to England to do the research, and there I joined the London Feminist History Group, and we published a book called The Sexual Dynamics of History, which we were very proud of. Yeah. And I made some very dear close friends who are still dear close friends, and we were from all over, in a way that was great, because in the US at that time, funding in graduate school was year by year, so it was very competitive. Yeah. So it was very nice to be in this group where we weren't competing with each other. We were actually, you know, all helping each other. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. How exciting. I mean, so you've been supervised by, you were supervised by men. How?
No, Carol Smith Rosenberg was
okay,
leading
right.
feminist historian in the States at the time.
Great. Okay. Sorry. I was going to ask you, like, how was it convincing your supervisors that, you know, this was a topic that you needed to pursue?
Well, it was interesting actually. So I went to the States in 1977, and Carol Smith Rosenberg and her then partner took me to a women's history conference in Maryland, and it was so exciting. You know, here was lots of people thinking about women's history. And at that conference, Angus McLaren, who's a Canadian, gave a paper on abortion. And I thought, well, here are people doing exactly what I want to do. So I don't think I had any trouble convincing people in academia that it was okay to do that. But lots of people thought that abortion was a kind of sociological topic. They couldn't really understand how it was a historical topic. And in a way, what I wrote was a history of crime. I spent my time in what was then Chancery Lane, where they kept criminal records in London, looking at women who, you know, cases of women who were prosecuted for being backstreet abortionists or women who died from backstreet abortion. So those kind of records led me to understand the kind of networks that women had at the time. And I did a sort of thematic approach. I looked at the law, I looked at medicine, and I looked at those networks, and I looked at the sort of foundation of the Abortion Law Reform Association and the women who were involved in that.
Oh,
and I published that as a book, and I extended the time frame to the reform of the law in '67, and that came out in 1988.
Golly. All right. So we've got to the end of your training, and so what happens next?
Well, I was very fortunate in that there was a postdoc advertised at Otago just as I finished my PhD. So I was awarded that postdoctoral fellowship. So I went to the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. One of the academics, who I won't name, said to me, in the States, said to me, "Why are you exiling yourself to New Zealand?" And I thought, well, that's pretty odd. It's my home. But, you know, that's what it seemed to them very strange, I think, to go back. But then I was fortunate that a job came up, and I got a 3-year assistant lectureship in the department. And then after that, I got a permanent job, and I had a very happy career at the University of Otago.
Right. Yes, you were lucky, weren't you? I mean, the jobs in history are so few and far between.
They were very scarce. Yeah.
So are you're still an instructor, or you emeritus, or what's
I'm a professor emerita.
Okay, emerita.
I retired in end of June 2020.
Okay. Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah. But I'm writing a book at the moment, and I have lots to do.
Yes. Yeah. No, I understand. Yep. Okay. So I guess one part of this question that I haven't asked you is, what would you consider your most significant lifetime achievements, let's say to this point professionally?
Well, I mean, it took me most of my academic career to write my history of women in New Zealand. So it was terrific when that came out in 2016, and then wonderful that it won the Ockham Award. So that feels like a very significant achievement. And I think hopefully it will have a lasting impact and encourage others to do research in that area. For me, in 2017, it was a terrific honour also to be invited back to the UK for the conference to mark 50 years of the passing of the 1967 Abortion Act. Oh, and the conference was held at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and my book was on display. So my book you know, my PhD book. So my book, which had seemed somewhat naughty at the time it came out in 1988, was now seen to be, you know, on the right side of history. So that was really great.
Oh,
Yeah.
fabulous.
So that was good. Yeah, I mean, I think I had a lot of, I had a very challenging, but I think very rewarding time being head of what was then the history department at Otago for 8 years, where I felt I was really able to promote great research projects with my colleagues. So that was rewarding, and actually all the students I've taught have been great fun. And I'm fortunate now that I live in another part of the country, in Wellington, and many of them are here, so I bump into them. I really enjoy supervising, particularly honours dissertations and postgraduate work. So I think over my career at Otago, we built up a tremendous bank of research in women's history. So that was terrific. One other wonderful thing that happened was that colleagues at Otago organised a conference in my honour, and a conference in women's history, and about 150 people came, and as a result of that, also my keynote address for that was entitled "Past Caring: Women, Work and Emotion," and we produced a volume a couple of years later with that title. So
nice.
That grew out of that conference. So that was very pleasing to me. Yeah.
Gosh, lots of accomplishments there. That's wonderful. And you're not finished yet, obviously. You're working on a book.
No, still going.
Yes. So let's move on now to the second block of questions, and this is background about your work, and you've answered some of them, but I'll give them to you again so that you can maybe elaborate. What drew you to the work that you do and have done? The question I'm interested in this lot is, has your work changed in ways that have been shaped by experiences from your own life and vice versa? So have experiences, has your work changed because of your life experiences, and has your life changed because of your work experiences, I guess?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly, as I mentioned, it was doing history that really caught my, and really promoted my engagement with feminism, because of what I learned about the difficulties women had in the past in their reproductive lives. Yes. And then I worked on the history of mental illness, because we had fantastic records at Otago, and also a relative of mine had suffered from mental breakdown when I was a child and he was a teenager, and that really was very bewildering for everyone around at that time. And so I wanted to sort of understand more about the history and treatment of mental illness. So, you know, life affected my work in that way, but that work also made me interested in other aspects. You know, for example, they photographed people in the asylum. Frederick Truby King, who's terrifically well known in New Zealand as the founder of Plunkett, was a great photographer, and he photographed the patients. And so that led me to an interest in asylum photography. Yeah, so then how the work affected my life, I suppose. I've been very fortunate in being an academic. I have 3 sons. I never had maternity leave. I was always able to juggle my children with leave, and the University of Otago had absolutely excellent daycare, which made my life possible. It was so close to my office that they would ring me up if a child needed breastfeeding, and I could walk over and baby. So those things made my life possible, and also my American husband gave up an academic career in one field and came to New Zealand and trained in another. Ended up on the law faculty, and so we had a kind of flexibility that made life possible. Although, in a way, as an academic, one's work is one's love.
Yeah.
You know, people are still surprised that I'm retired and I get up every morning and sit down and but that's because I really enjoy writing and I enjoy history.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. Yeah, okay. So you've really spoken to all of the questions on that. Is there anything else you want to add about the changes in life and work and their reciprocity, or I don't know?
Well, I think because the department had been very good to me, I was okay about taking on the role of being a head of department for a, quite a long period, because you have to take on that role. I think you have to feel that you're there for others, not there for yourself in a way.
Yes.
And so that affected that choice. And there's one other life event that affected my work, and that my sister, who was 11 years older than me, died in 2015. And that made me really think about caring and the history of caring. So that's when I worked on the Past Caring project and thought about the way all the work that women do,
Yes,
with regards to care, is unacknowledged, unpaid, and what does it all mean?
Yeah. Yes, you're touching on very familiar themes. Yeah. All right, so let's move on now to reflections on your work. So the big question in this block of questions is, how do you understand the term feminism?
Well, I understand it in terms of equal rights and opportunities, but I also understand it as a term whereby difference has to be recognised. So that women's role, we need parental leave, and we need to rethink the gendering of care work.
Yes, yeah.
And these are very difficult things. So yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm the mother of 3 sons.
Yes.
But I think that they all understand these issues.
Yes, because traditionally, it would be the daughters who would look after mum, when so are they prepped?
Yeah.
Okay. So all the other ones in here wasn't meant for your work. Yep.
I mean, when you say about how it worked in our organisation, I was one of the founders at Otago with another young person at that time. We were young, in philosophy, of the Women's Staff Caucus at the university, which brought together women across the university, whether they were general or academic staff.
Right.
And they, we would do both kind of social occasions just to get to know people across the university that you wouldn't normally meet, and also lobbying in terms of equal opportunity matters. Okay,
so you bring up a good point. So that's in the institution, but you spoke a little bit before about you'd been an advocate for abortion rights and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How did you continue with that sort of advocacy work or activism work later on?
A little bit. So when I was first back at the university, and really before I had my second child, I was involved in family planning in Dunedin, which was at that time a voluntary organisation. You know, the nature of these organisations changed over time, but at that point they relied on voluntary work, and I was the president for a while. So I was involved in that kind of thing. But more and more, I think my activism has really been through my work. And,
right. Yeah.
Through the kind of research I do. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So that sort of brings me to the next block of questions, thinking about the relationship between feminist scholarship and activism. So how do you perceive that relationship?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's terrifically important to write about the challenges that women have faced in the past. I mean, at the 2017 conference in Britain, you know, one of the women who'd been very active over time came up to me with my book and said, oh, you know, this has been so good and I've lost so many copies because I've given it to friends, you know. And so you feel actually it's really helped people who are activists understand the history. And I feel that about the, you know, my history of New Zealand women, that it helps people understand how circumstances were created and how things changed or didn't change.
Right.
And yeah, I've written a piece on shame and its histories, about the gendering of shame in New Zealand, thinking about, you know, how illegitimacy was once shamed, but for men, failing as a breadwinner was shamed. You know, and what's the relationship between these two things, and why are men shamed for different things than women are, and how does that play out? And people found that useful. So yeah, I think you know, the body of work has been helpful to activists.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, one of my interventions with a very dear colleague of mine who's an epidemiologist was when a book came out that justified Herbert Green's actions at National Women's Hospital, where women were really research subjects. You know, I both spoke at the New Zealand Historical Association conference and wrote a critique of that book, written by you know, somebody who'd been a colleague and friend, and that's very hard in a small academic community.
Yes. Yeah.
So I regard that really as a very important piece of activism, even though it was a sort of scholarly intervention, but I think one had to point out the kind of flaws in the argument.
Yeah, no, fair enough. That was a terrible thing that I've only just recently found out and read about. So yeah. So I guess you've talked, no, you have really told me all about that, both your own scholarship and in general. But so I'll ask you this, and it seems like a bit of a no-brainer. Do you identify as a feminist?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so why?
Well, it's hard if you study the history of women not to feel aggrieved at the fact that, you know, women were paid less for doing exactly the same job as men, that a lot of their work in the home was taken for granted. I mean, I think, you know, one of the great things about being a historian is you have to understand the complexity. You know, you have to understand why women gave babies up for adoption, even if they didn't want to. Well, they couldn't work and look after a baby, you know. They were caught in a nest of circumstances which made particular outcomes the only way they could move. So I think it's and I guess I think too that my mother was very ambitious for me. You know, she wanted me to travel and to do things and not get tied down, as she would say. because she would have liked to have had more education herself. So she, she wanted me to have opportunities she didn't have, and it's remarkable the changes we've seen over time in New Zealand. To have an unmarried woman who gave birth as our Prime Minister, fantastic.
Yes. Well, yeah.
And so that wouldn't have been possible, I think, without second wave feminism. And I think a lot of the opportunities I've had wouldn't have been possible without that either.
Yeah. So I wondered if you could touch a little bit on, because I haven't read the book, but the History of Women in New Zealand, the 2016 book. And so one of the taglines is from the first waka to, and a waka is a Maori canoe, from the first Maori canoe to now. So were there ethnic differences in the history of women? Did you in your book, do you touch on those differences?
Yeah, in fact, that was the thing that kept me going. That was the great challenge, to think that the history of women in New Zealand is not about Pākehā.
Yeah.
So yeah, and to know that when married women were agitating for property rights, it was said in Parliament, well, there's a group of women in this country who already have property rights.
Right.
Māori women.
Right, which doesn't have Pākehā women's argument at all, but it's true. Yes.
So Māori women could control resources in a way that Pākehā women couldn't.
Yeah.
So all those things I explored pointed up how different the two histories were.
Yeah. So fascinating, worth a read, obviously.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Since I spent most of my life on it.
Okay. All right.
It feels very self-indulgent to talk about oneself all the time. So I mean, I would like to say, and I must say at some point, how important other colleagues have been.
Right. Well, you could say that now. Like, are there particular colleagues that have helped you?
Yes. So my dear friends and colleagues, Charlotte MacDonald, who's Professor of History at Victoria, she and I actually met in the London Feminist History Group. She'd come from New Zealand and I'd come from the States.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So she and I and Margaret Tennant did a book in 1986 on women's history, collection of essays, and then we did a second volume later on. And so their support and encouragement and ideas and collaboration have been really important in my career.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else you want to specifically highlight?
Well, I've had lots of great colleagues. Yes, and there's lots of great younger people coming through, which is wonderful to see. But that's probably I don't want to. I can't go on and name them.
The pipeline is looking healthy. Is the pipeline looking healthy then?
It is. But the sad thing is the lack of jobs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So how about we talk about in this next block of questions the intersection of your work with the women's movement in this country and globally. So the big question, what's your analysis, evaluation and expectation of the development of feminism in New Zealand?
Well, you're asking me to recap parts of my book, I think, which I'm not going to do.
Okay.
So we're at an interesting point now. I think it's where I think various things need to be rethought, and I'm sure younger women are thinking about them. And one is work-life balance. In a way, we leapt straight into the male working week, which leaves no time for family. Every woman's expected to work now, and that leads to difficulties with caring for children. The privatisation of childcare in New Zealand is not such a great thing, I don't think. So, there are all sorts of,
Yes.
it's always like 2 steps forward, 1 step back in many ways, I think. I think we have a majority of women in Parliament now, so that's pretty amazing. And I suppose there is this kind of split within feminism currently between the support for trans activism and recognition of women's rights, which don't seem like they should be opposed, but in some cases they are, I think. So that's a difficult issue.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, that came to the fore this past week with Posy Parker, or her alter ego with Posy Parker, her visit, and then the aborted visit to Wellington. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't really know anything about her, but I do think there are issues to be debated, and they are certainly, I think, being debated in the UK and Scotland at the moment about the role of trans in women's prisons, for example.
Yes,
and I think these are really important questions that we need to be discussing, and I think I guess one of the things that's always been interesting to me is medicalisation and what it makes possible.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And sometimes feminists have felt very negatively towards medicalisation. It's control of women's bodies. And in other cases, medicalisation is the answer to some problems.
Right. Yeah.
So I see that as a really interesting thing we should be debating.
Yes. Yeah. Open debate rather than
open debate.
Agreed. It's a very nuanced and thorny question that trying to get all of the facets together is a very difficult.
And I mean, I think sometimes I read something by Zadie Smith recently where she said this generation doesn't know what an ad hominem argument is, and I think it'd be a shame if we lost the ability just to argue about an issue without it being seen as an attack on a person.
Yeah, a personal attack. Yes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Okay, so I guess the other questions in this block are, what is your relationship with other women's organisations in this country and in other countries, and what do you think about your work in relation to a women's movement, so to speak? And I would jump in and sort of say, I think you've answered these, but if you've got anything further that you would like to say about your networks globally and locally.
Well, I feel very fortunate in that in my graduate school life, I spent time in the States and in Britain. So I know scholars in those countries. And of course, over one's life as an academic, you go to international conferences, and I went to a lot of feminist history conferences, so we'd meet up regularly. And I was fortunate to work with 2 Canadian scholars, Tracy Penny-Light and Wendy Mitchinson, on a book called Bodily Subjects. We got funding in Canada to think about the gendered history of bodies. So those relationships have always been really important to me. And currently an American historian who I knew, who was ahead of me in graduate school, is reading my latest book manuscript, which is on an American woman doctor. So I'm so lucky to have those links because, you know, I'm here in New Zealand. I'm not an American historian, but this project has taken me in that direction. So
Right.
I'm lucky to have input from someone from there.
Your exile to New Zealand.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess especially when you retire and you move cities as you've done, it can be it's not a it's a lonely occupation, or it can feel like you're you know, you go into your room in the morning
Yeah.
and get up and you know, do your work. But to know that you have those colleagues and networks that you can turn to is very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I have a good group, the gender history group here in Wellington. So we get together about once every 6 weeks. So that's great.
That's fun. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. Okay, so shall we move on? Are you is there anything further that you'd like to talk to about your work in relation to women's movements, perhaps?
Well, I think one of the differences, and why I feel very fortunate to have been exiled to New Zealand, is that from the moment I came back, we were always challenged by Indigenous scholars. So we have had to take the history of colonialism in this country very seriously.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're in the US, I think you can do a whole lot of US history and not think about Native Americans. You might think about slavery, but do you think much about Native Americans?
Right.
Only
I do think that's changing somewhat, but again, you know, there is pretty much a dearth of Native American scholars in institutions. So
yeah. I mean, I think in a way, because of the challenge here, it's been really great for me as a historian.
Yes. Yeah. And actually I would add it's been great for me coming back as a psychologist person because that's something that when I was living in New Zealand previously, I didn't think terribly much about that, you know, but coming back after 20 some odd years, it's been, it's very different, and it is challenging, but in a good way, I think, you know.
Yeah. And so one of my recent pieces, I've written a little bit about Mason Jury, who you must be familiar with. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So, you know, he went to McGill.
Yes.
Yeah, where they thought about cross-cultural psychiatry.
Right. Yeah.
It's really, you know, it's really interesting, those international connections.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Okay, so I guess that really does bring us into the connections with other activist scholars and organizations in other countries. So you've talked about that a little bit, and you've talked about how those came about. And you've talked about some of the differences and similarities and the kinds of issues raised, but have you noticed any other specific sort of history of women, perhaps, type issues that have been very different, say, in the US and the UK and New Zealand?
I can't think of great different. I mean, what I'm always intrigued about actually is the kind of fashions in history, and how we think we're doing something new here, and then we find out it's being done there. You know, that there's sort of international trends, just like there is with babies' names. Yeah, but you know, I think the other thing about being a historian is the particular attention to the context, and context is all, and that's New Zealand's very, you know, it's different in so many ways. It's a very small population. It's you know, it's the first country in the world to give women the vote, or women won the vote, you know, and so how did that happen? And, you know, and Māori women were included in that. There was no question about that. So we are different in those kind of ways, but I think the scholars overseas are asking similar questions in there, have been for a while.
Right. Yeah.
It's just, so I can't, I suppose, again, with fashions, there've been fashions in theorists. It was all Foucault for a while, and Derrida, and Judith Butler. So I'm not, maybe in a way these things all come to academia. I mean, particularly now in the digital world, we're all familiar with what people are writing.
Yes.
Almost instantaneously. And that's been a huge transformation across my lifetime. In fact, I feel sorry for graduate students now. When I decided to do my thesis on abortion in Britain, I couldn't Google that. And if I did now, there would be, 10,000 things I felt I had to look at.
Right. Yes. Well, there's that. And then there's also the physical pleasure of going into the archives somewhere and smelling and reading and seeing, the original documents. That's amazing. Yeah. So you miss a lot, I think, by electronic means, but yeah.
Yeah. But it can be very overwhelming.
Yes.
You can think, so much I have to read before I have an idea of my own.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I don't think, well, possibly that never goes away, does it? Whatever means you use to do your research.
Well, I just think there wasn't so much when you were.
Yeah.
Well, there probably wasn't so much anyway, because women's history was so new when I started out.
Right.
There's been this huge proliferation. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so we're at the end of the scripted questions. I do have one further question that I wanted to ask, whether you have some knowledge or whether it's an opinion, or however you would like to phrase it, however you want to approach it. It's been pointed out to me coming back to New Zealand from the States that there are the way that institutions approach women's studies courses is very different in the two countries. And in New Zealand, there were women's studies courses, but they seem to have sort of disappeared or been folded into other departments or other schools in academic institutions. Do you happen to know the history of that, or do you have any opinions about why that might have come about?
Well, a little bit. I think most of the groupings now in New Zealand are called gender studies, rather than women's studies. And there's been a desire at universities not to have small units for a long time. So even history at Otago now is part of a program. It's a program within a larger school of something or other. So they were always very small in New Zealand. I mean, our departments are small compared to many of the departments in the States. I thought we had a lot of people in history when we had 14. That's the sort of size. So for a while, gender studies had 3 staff really, and that's what they survived on. But they were part of bigger units all the time, I think, at Otago. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. There might have once been a standalone grouping, but I mean, I couldn't speak for the whole country. I mean, I think the good side, though, which we should remember, is that now, like geography departments hire specialists in gender and geography. There are people all through the university who think of gender, so it doesn't get
ghettoized. Yes.
Well, it's not just in that small grouping. So I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, that puts a different light on it, I think. Okay, that makes sense to me. All right. So is there anything further that you'd like to comment on about your life, about women's history in New Zealand, about your experiences with local and global colleagues or anything?
Well, I suppose one could feel isolated in New Zealand, but the internet's really helped overcome that. You know, for a while when I had small children, it was quite hard to travel internationally. And it was hard to have the time really to think in a large way that you need when you're doing a big book. But I don't, you know, that's just life really. You know, I think my international connections have always been really important, and particularly the group in the London Feminist History group. And very grateful for those friendships over time. And for the encouragement. I think, you know, when Charlotte McDonald and I first gave a paper, and I hope she won't mind me talking about this, at the NZHA, you know, we practiced together and were slightly terrified. And now we're regarded as the old, you know, authorities on things. So it's been a huge transition, and it's been very nice to experience it with friends.
Yeah, that's neat. Okay, I have no further questions. If you're okay, I will stop the recording now. Thank you so much for your time.